The glass doors of Sterling and Stone didn't just slide open. They parted with a hushed, expensive whisper that dared you to walk through without drowning. I checked my reflection in the polished brass plate. Suit tailored, spine straight, imposter syndrome tucked deep into my briefcase next to the $50 million settlement offer. This was my first negotiation as lead counsel, and I was walking into the lion's den. Victoria Sterling didn't lose cases. She didn't even settle them unless she extracted a pound of flesh first. I saw her through the conference room glass before she saw me. She commanded the space, standing at the head of the table, reviewing a file with the precision of a surgeon about to cut. When I entered, she didn't smile. She extended a hand, her grip firm, cool, and terrifyingly competent. The scent of sandalwood and something sharp, like ozone before a storm, hit me instantly. "Morgan," she said, her voice low and resonant. "Let's begin." The air in the conference room was pressurized, heavy with the kind of silence that usually precedes a guilty verdict. Victoria didn't waste time with pleasantries or the usual legal posturing. She sat perfectly still, her hands clasped on the mahogany table, and opened with a precedent from the Second Circuit that I hadn't just read. I'd memorized it, feared it, and built my entire strategy around avoiding it. She laid it out like a royal flush, her voice calm, modulated, and utterly devastating. She was gutting my position with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times, stripping away my leverage layer by layer. For a moment, I felt the familiar cold slide of panic tightening my chest. She was good, better than the rumors. But she was operating on the assumption that I was playing by the old rules, that I was just another junior associate sent to be steamrolled. "Miss Sterling," I interrupted, keeping my voice level, though my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "That precedent relies on the assumption of willful negligence. But if you look at page 402 of the Discovery Addendum," I slid the document across the table, watching her eyes track the movement. Her gaze flicked to the paper, scanning the highlighted text, then snapped back to me. The silence stretched, tight as a piano wire. Then her jaw tightened, a microscopic shift, a ripple in the calm surface of her composure. She hadn't missed it. She'd underestimated me. The dynamic in the room shifted. It wasn't a landslide, but the ground under her feet was no longer solid. She leaned back, tapping a pen against her lips, assessing me with a new, dangerous intensity. "Interesting interpretation," she murmured, and for the first time, she looked at me not as a nuisance, but as an opponent worth her time. We broke for coffee 2 hours later. The tension had moved from professional to something thicker, more physical, hanging in the air like humidity. I went to the credenza in the corner to pour water, my hand shaking just slightly from the adrenaline crash. I didn't hear her approach over the hum of the HVAC. I turned and we collided, not hard, but enough that I had to steady myself against the marble top. Her hand shot out, catching my elbow to keep me upright. The contact was electric, immediate. Her fingers were warm through the fabric of my suit jacket, her grip lingering a fraction of a second longer than professional courtesy required. I looked up, and she was close. Too close for a negotiation, perfect for something else. I saw the faint lines of exhaustion fanning out from her eyes, the tension held tight in the slope of her shoulders like a coiled spring. She wasn't just a monolith of legal prowess. She was carrying the weight of the entire firm on that tailored blazer. "Sorry," I breathed, though I didn't move away. The space between us felt charged, magnetic. She didn't apologize. She just held my gaze, her eyes dark and unreadable, searching my face for something that wasn't in the case files. "You have a sharp eye, Morgan," she said quietly, her voice dropping an octave, stripping away the courtroom projection. "Most people miss the addendum." The praise felt like a physical touch, a caress against my professional vanity. "I'm not most people," I replied, the words slipping out before I could filter them. A corner of her mouth quirked up, almost a smile, but guarded. "No," she agreed. "You're not." She released my arm, but the ghost of her touch burned on my skin. She stepped back, smoothing her blazer, the armor sliding back into place, but the air between us was still humming with unsaid things. "The files are extensive," she said, her tone professional again, but her eyes lingered on mine. "We won't finish this today. Come to my office tonight, 8 o'clock. We can review the financials without the audience." It was a command, not a question, and as I watched her walk back to the table, I knew I would be there, not just for the case, but because I needed to know what lay beneath that perfect, polished defense. Her office at 8:15 was a study in high-altitude isolation, a glass box suspended 40 floors above the city grid, where the noise of traffic was reduced to a silent, rhythmic pulse of light. It was a space designed to intimidate, stripped of personal clutter or softness, housing only sleek mid-century furniture and the kind of heavy silence that usually costs $500 an hour. Victoria didn't sit behind the massive slab of marble that served as her desk. Instead, she worked standing up, pacing the length of the floor-to-ceiling windows like she was delivering a closing argument to the skyline. She had discarded her blazer, revealing a silk blouse the color of deep charcoal that draped against her frame, softening the formidable silhouette I had seen in the conference room, but doing nothing to diminish the authority she radiated. I sat at a smaller round table near the corner, surrounded by stacks of discovery documents that smelled of toner and old dust. The only light came from a brass desk lamp and the ambient glow of the city below, casting long, shifting shadows across the room every time she moved. I was trying to focus on the liability clauses in the third quarter financials, my yellow highlighter squeaking softly against the paper, but my attention kept drifting to her. She moved with a restless, predatory energy, reviewing a deposition file while walking, her heels clicking a sharp, deliberate cadence on the hardwood floor. It wasn't nervous energy. It was kinetic power looking for a target. "You're thorough," she said, not turning from the window. Her voice was lower now, stripped of the courtroom theatrics, intimate in the quiet room. Most associates would have just flagged the summary and gone home to their lives. "I don't like surprises," I replied, capping the highlighter. The click sounded loud in the stillness. "And I don't have a life when I'm on a case like this." She turned then, leaning against the glass, her arms crossed. The city lights framed her, turning her loose hair into a halo of dark static. She wasn't looking at the files anymore. She was watching my hands. I became suddenly, acutely aware of my own fingers resting on the paper, the way my knuckles were white with tension. Her gaze was clinical, yet heated, dissecting me with the same precision she applied to the law. "Tell me something, Morgan. Off the record." She walked toward the table, her movements fluid, and pulled out the chair adjacent to mine. She didn't sit opposite me. She sat next to me, close enough that the scent of her sandalwood perfume drowned out the smell of the documents. "Why this? You have the instinct for the kill. I saw that today. But you hesitate before you strike. You don't enjoy the blood." I looked at her, startled by the proximity. I could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, the slight smudge of ink on her thumb. "I'm tired of winning small battles that don't change the war," I admitted, the truth slipping out before I could polish it. "I want to build something, not just dismantle the opposition." Victoria laughed, a dry, humorless sound that didn't reach her eyes. She leaned in, resting her chin on her hand, her face inches from mine. "Winning is all there is, counselor. Construction is a myth we tell ourselves to sleep at night. In the end, you either conquer the ground or you get buried in it. That's what he taught me." Her voice wavered on the word he, a microscopic fracture in the porcelain facade. For a split second, the invincible Victoria Sterling looked tired, haunted by a ghost I couldn't see. The air between us thickened, charged with a sudden, confusing gravity. I shifted in my chair, turning to face her fully, and under the table, her knee brushed against mine. It was a light contact, barely a graze, but it sent a jolt of electricity straight up my spine. She didn't pull away. She held the contact, her eyes locking onto mine, challenging me to acknowledge the breach, her leg warm and solid against mine in the cool, quiet room. The morning sun that flooded the deposition room was harsh, bleaching out the shadows where we had hidden the night before. It was 9 a.m., and the intimacy of the darkened office felt like a hallucination, replaced by the sterile hum of the stenographer's machine and the smell of stale office coffee. We were back on the record. Victoria sat at the head of the table, her posture rigid, her face a mask of bored indifference. She didn't look at me. She was focused entirely on her witness, a nervous chief financial officer named Henderson, who looked like he was regretting every life choice that had led him to this chair. Victoria had prepped him for a fight. I could see it in the way he braced himself every time I opened my mouth, expecting the attack, the trap, the aggressive cross-examination that was Sterling & Stone's signature brand. But I didn't give him a fight. I gave him silence. I let the pauses stretch out until they became uncomfortable, heavy things that he felt compelled to fill. I kept my voice soft, almost apologetic, asking him to clarify the timeline, just for my own understanding. I wasn't the shark he had been warned about. I was the confused junior lawyer asking for help. And slowly, brick by brick, his defenses came down. He started to explain, to justify, and in doing so, he handed me the inconsistencies on a silver platter. I glanced at Victoria. She hadn't objected once. She wasn't scribbling notes or signaling her client to stop. She was watching me. Her pen was suspended in the air, her gaze fixed on my face with a look of intense, calculating curiosity. She wasn't watching the case crumble. She was watching how I was dismantling it. It was a dissection, clean and bloodless, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something that looked dangerously like respect behind her guarded expression. When Henderson finally admitted that the safety reports had been delayed, not lost, the room went dead silent. The admission hung there, a smoking gun that changed the entire liability landscape. I closed my folder. Thank you, Mr. Henderson. I have nothing further. The ride down to the lobby afterward was suffocating. We were the only two people in the elevator, enclosed in a box of brushed steel and mirrors that reflected us back at each other from infinite angles. The descent was smooth, but my stomach dropped as if we were in free fall. I stood near the control panel, staring at the changing floor numbers, acutely aware of her standing just behind my left shoulder. I could feel the heat radiating from her, the magnetic pull that seemed to ignore the laws of professional conduct. "You have a dangerous way of getting what you want," she said. Her voice was low, barely audible over the hum of the lift. "You made him feel safe right before you cut his legs out from under him. It was elegant." "I just asked the questions, Victoria." "No," she corrected, stepping closer. "You got under his skin." She reached out, and for a second, I thought she was going to hit the emergency stop. Instead, her hand brushed mine, cool and deliberate. Her thumb found the inside of my wrist, right where my pulse was hammering against the metal band of my watch. She traced the line of the vein, a slow, mesmerizing movement that made my breath hitch in my throat. It wasn't a handshake. It was a diagnostic check. She was measuring the effect she had on me. "You're racing," she whispered, her eyes locking onto mine in the reflection of the doors. "Is that the adrenaline of the win? Or is it me?" "You know the answer to that," I managed to say, my voice steady despite the havoc she was wreaking on my nervous system. The elevator chimed for the lobby, but neither of us moved. The doors remained closed for a beat too long. She dropped her hand, the loss of contact leaving my skin cold, but she didn't step back. The air between us was thick, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the $50 million on the table. "It's not just about the money," she said suddenly, the vulnerability returning to her voice, sharp and unexpected. "Arthur Stone, the founder. He's dying, Morgan." I turned to face her, the revelation hitting me with the force of a physical blow. Stone was a legend. The man who had built the firm from the ground up, the man who had made Victoria who she was. "I didn't know," I said softly. "He has weeks, maybe less," she continued, her gaze dropping to the floor. "He wants this settled. He wants to know the firm is bulletproof before he goes. This case, it's his final test for me, my burden of proof. I'm not just fighting for a client. I'm fighting for his legacy. and I can't be the one who loses it. By 8 p.m., the city outside was a grid of amber and steel. But inside Victoria's office, the world had shrunk down to the circle of light cast by her desk lamp. We had moved past the adversarial phase of the negotiation and into something that felt dangerously like collaboration. The heavy mahogany desk, usually a barricade, was now cluttered with takeout containers, spicy basil noodles and dumplings that steamed in the cool air, sitting incongruously next to the finalized settlement drafts. We were eating like conspirators planning a coup, rather than opposing counsel finalizing a divorce between two corporate giants. The revelation in the elevator had changed the architecture of the room. The air was no longer pressurized with the need to win. It was heavy with the weight of what she was about to lose. I watched her pick at her food, her movements mechanical, lacking the predatory grace she displayed in the courtroom. The exhaustion was no longer hidden. It sat in the hollows of her cheeks and the curve of her spine, a physical burden that seemed to pull her toward the earth. She wasn't the invincible managing partner of Sterling and Stone right now. She was a woman watching the clock run out on the only father figure she had ever known. "He took me on when I was 24, she said suddenly, breaking the silence. She didn't look up from her plate. I was raw, aggressive, and completely unpolished. I wore cheap suits and argued with judges. She swirled a noodle around her fork, staring at the motion as if reading a pattern there. The other partners wanted to fire me 3 times in my first year. They said I was abrasive, that I didn't understand the nuance of the game. What did Arthur do? I asked, keeping my voice soft, trying not to disturb the fragile surface of her memory. He gave me his office, she said, a small, sad smile touching her lips. He moved into a smaller associate's room down the hall for a week and let me sit in the big chair. He told me, "The only reason they call you abrasive is because you're sharper than they are. Don't dull the blade, Victoria. Just learn how to aim it." She looked up at me then, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears that she would never let fall. "This settlement, it's not about the money. It never was. It's about proving that the blade is still sharp, that the house he built won't crumble the moment he's gone." The vulnerability in her voice was a physical ache in the room. I could see the terror behind the ambition, the fear that without him, she was just a girl in a cheap suit pretending to be a giant. I acted without consulting the rulebook or my better judgment. I stood up, walked around the edge of the desk, and stopped beside her chair. She went still, her breath hitching, but she didn't pull away. "You're not that girl anymore," I whispered. I reached out, placing my hand on her shoulder. The silk of her blouse was cool, but her skin underneath was burning. It was a breach of every professional protocol in the book, a violation of the invisible barrier that separates opposing counsel. But it felt necessary. It felt like a suture closing a wound. Victoria didn't stiffen. Instead, she did something that shattered me. She leaned in. She tilted her head, pressing her cheek against the back of my hand, closing her eyes. It was a surrender of gravity, a moment of absolute trust from a woman who trusted no one. I could smell her clearly now, not just the sandalwood perfume, but the scent of the rain that had started to fall against the glass and the sharp, metallic tang of ink. It was the scent of a storm held in check. My thumb brushed the line of her jaw, feeling the tension locked in the muscle there. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the city and the synchronized rhythm of our breathing. We were on the precipice of something that couldn't be undone. Her eyes opened, dark and dilated, locking onto mine with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. Then, the reality of the room rushed back in. The phone on her desk buzzed, a single harsh vibration that sounded like a gunshot. Victoria pulled back as if she'd been burned. The transition was instant and brutal. She straightened her spine, the mask slamming down with audible force. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by the cool, impenetrable glaze of professional privilege. She cleared her throat, adjusting her blazer, putting the desk back between us physically and metaphorically. "We should finish the review," she said, her voice crisp, though I heard the faint tremor underneath. "The liability clauses won't draft themselves." "Right," I said, stepping back, my hand feeling cold and empty where she had been. Of course. But as she reached for her pen, her hand hovered over the paper for a fraction of a second, and her eyes flicked up to meet mine. The look held a beat too long, a silent acknowledgement of the line we had almost crossed, and the terrifying realization that we both wanted to cross it again. The privilege had been waived, and we both knew it. The clock on the wall read 12:14. Midnight had come and gone, taking with it the last shreds of our professional distance, yet leaving the case itself in a stubborn, unyielding knot. The conference table was a wasteland of red-lined drafts and discarded strategies. We had argued every clause, debated every comma, and somehow we were exactly where we started, deadlocked. The terms were balanced on a razor's edge, too generous for my client to accept without losing face, too restrictive for hers to sign without admitting liability. It was the kind of stalemate that usually ends in a judge's chambers, bitter and unresolved. But we weren't leaving. The building around us was a tomb. The cleaning crews had long since finished their rounds. The hum of the HVAC system was the only sound in the world. Victoria stood by the whiteboard, staring at a diagram of settlement tiers we had drawn 3 hours ago. She had taken off her heels, a detail that felt shockingly intimate, seeing her barefoot on the plush carpet, grounded in a way she never allowed herself to be. Her blazer was draped over a chair, and her silk blouse was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the hollow of her throat where a pulse fluttered, betraying the calm mask she tried to maintain. I watched her back, the tension still held tight in those shoulders. We had run out of arguments. We had run out of precedents. There was nothing left to say about the money or the liability or the legacy of Arthur Stone. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, charged with the electricity that had been building between us since that first handshake. "We're stuck," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. "There's no legal avenue we haven't exhausted, Victoria. If we push any harder, the whole deal collapses." She didn't turn around immediately. She just erased a line on the whiteboard with her thumb, a slow, deliberate smudge of blue ink. "The deal isn't the problem, Morgan," she said, her voice low, vibrating with exhaustion and something else, something darker. "The problem is that I can't let you win, and you won't let me lose." "I'm not trying to make you lose, aren't you?" She turned then, and the look in her eyes stopped the breath in my throat. It wasn't anger. It was a challenge, raw and undisguised. She leaned back against the whiteboard, crossing her arms, but the defensive posture looked less like a shield and more like a cage she was waiting for someone to open. "You've spent the last 48 hours dismantling my case, piece by piece. You found the cracks I didn't know existed. You made my witness question his own reality. You made me question mine." She took a step toward me, closing the distance that we had carefully maintained all night. "So finish it," she whispered. The command hung in the air, ambiguous and dangerous. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Finish what, Victoria? The settlement?" She shook her head, a microscopic movement. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then back up to my eyes, burning with a clarity that terrified me. "Undermine my defenses," she said. The words were soft, but they hit with the force of a verdict. That's what you came here to do, isn't it? You didn't come just to settle a lawsuit. You came to see if you could break the unshakable Victoria Sterling. The air between us ignited. It wasn't about the case anymore. It was about the walls she had built around herself, the fortress of legacy and expectation and grief. She was handing me the key, daring me to turn it. I stepped closer, invading her personal space until I could feel the heat radiating from her skin. I was close enough to see the gold flecks in her irises, the slight tremor in her bottom lip. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. "Because once we do this, there's no striking it from the record. There's no objection that can fix it." She didn't speak. She just nodded, a single sharp dip of her chin. Her breath hitched, a small, broken sound that was the loudest thing in the room, It was a tell. The great negotiator had just shown her hand. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly as I traced the line of her jaw with one finger. I was mapping the tension, learning the geography of her resistance. Her skin was burning. As my finger brushed the sensitive spot beneath her ear, her eyes fluttered closed. She didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch, a surrender that felt like a victory and a defeat all at once. "Counselor," she breathed, the words sounding like a plea. I didn't wait for a closing argument. I closed the gap. The kiss wasn't gentle. It couldn't be. It was a collision of two forces that had been circling each other for days, a release of pressure that had become unbearable. It was necessary, urgent, a settlement of desire that we had both been denying. Her mouth was hot, demanding, tasting of coffee and the mint she had taken an hour ago. For a second, she stood rigid, stunned by the contact. Then, with a low sound in her throat, she broke. Her hands found my waist, gripping the fabric of my shirt, pulling me flush against her. The impact knocked the breath out of me. She kissed me like she argued, with precision, with intensity, with a desperate need to control the chaos she was finally letting in. I tangled my hands in her hair, ruining the perfect style, pulling her closer until there was no air left between us, no space for doubts or precedents or the $50 million sitting on the table. In the silence of the midnight office, we were finally, recklessly, rewriting the rules. The morning sun didn't feel like a fresh start. It felt like an interrogation lamp, harsh and exposing. I stood in my shower at 6 a.m., the hot water hammering against my skin, trying to scrub away the phantom sensation of her hands on my waist, but the memory was tattooed onto my nervous system. What we had done wasn't just a lapse in judgment or a moment of weakness. In the cold, unforgiving light of day, it looked terrifyingly like professional suicide. If the Bar Association caught wind of this, it wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was a conflict of interest so flagrant it could disbar us both. If Sterling and Stone found out, Victoria's legacy, the one she was so desperate to protect for Arthur, would be reduced to ash. And if my firm found out, I'd be lucky to find work filing papers in a basement archive. We had agreed, in the breathless, disheveled quiet before I left her office at 3 a.m., that it was a singular event, an anomaly. We would quarantine the variable. One night, she had said, her voice raspy with sleep and satisfaction. Then back to business. It sounded logical in the dark, but walking into the Sterling and Stone lobby the next morning, my briefcase heavy with the finalized settlement terms, logic felt like a very distant, abstract concept. I saw her by the reception desk. She looked impeccable, armored in a sharp navy suit that cost more than my car, her hair pulled back in that severe, perfect knot. She was talking to an associate, her face a mask of cool authority. But then she turned. Her eyes found mine across the expanse of polished marble, and for a split second, the mask slipped. It wasn't a smile. Victoria Sterling didn't smile in the lobby, but it was a recognition, a flash of heat that mirrored the sudden, erratic thumping of my heart. We had agreed to pretend it never happened, but my body was apparently not a signatory to that treaty. The conference room was torture. We were back in our assigned seats, the mahogany table stretching between us like a demilitarized zone. We went through the motions of the final review, checking language, verifying figures. But every time she spoke, every time she directed a comment my way, the subtext was deafening. "Counselor," she said, addressing a point about the indemnity clause. The word used to be a weapon in her mouth, a way to remind me of my rank. Now, it snagged in my chest. She said it with the same cadence she had used when she whispered it against my neck hours ago. The syllables were heavy, dragging with a weight that had nothing to do with the law. I couldn't look at her hands, those capable, elegant hands holding a Mont Blanc pen, without remembering how they felt tangled in my hair. The air in the room was thick, suffocating with the effort of repression. We were building a wall of professionalism, but the mortar was wet, and the structure was trembling. We had to take the private elevator down to the executive garage to meet the senior partners for the final signing lunch. As the doors slid shut, sealing us into the brushed steel box, the silence shifted. It went from the awkward quiet of colleagues to the charged, heavy silence of lovers. I stared at the floor numbers ticking down, refusing to look at her, terrified that one glance would shatter my resolve. But I could feel her. She shifted her weight, moving from the corner to stand directly behind my left shoulder. It was a subtle invasion of space, deniable in court, but unmistakable in intent. Then I felt it. Her hand. She didn't reach for my wrist this time. She placed her palm flat against the small of my back, right where my blazer had ridden up slightly. The heat was instantaneous, searing through the thin fabric of my blouse. It was a possessive, grounding touch, anchoring me to the floor, to the moment, to her. My breath hitched, a traitorous sound in the quiet lift. "Victoria," I warned, my voice low and trembling. I tried to step forward, to put distance between us, but I couldn't make my feet move. "We can't. The risk. If anyone sees—" "No cameras in here," she murmured, stepping closer until her chest brushed my shoulder. Her voice was right at my ear, sending shivers down my spine. "And no witnesses." "I'm objecting," I whispered, though I leaned back into her touch, my body betraying my words. "This is dangerous. We're crossing lines that exist for a reason." "Overruled," she breathed. Her thumb began to trace slow, deliberate circles against my spine, mesmerizing and maddening. "The case is the case, Morgan. The settlement is done. This?" She pressed her hand firmer against my back, pulling me infinitesimally closer. "This is separate. Don't conflate the venue with the verdict. We can be two things at once." "We're setting a precedent that has no case law," I argued weakly, closing my eyes as the sensation of her touch drowned out the warning bells in my head. "Then we write our own," she whispered. The elevator chimed for the garage level, and her hand vanished instantly, leaving my skin cold and aching for more. The doors opened, and she walked out first, her stride confident and untouched, leaving me to follow in her wake, terrified and thrilled by the dangerous dual reality we had just agreed to live in. The final negotiation was a piece of theater, staged for an audience that didn't realize they were watching a play we had already rehearsed in the dark. The grand conference room at Sterling & Stone was at maximum capacity. On one side, my firm's senior partners sat in a row of charcoal wool and skepticism. On the other, Victoria's team was a phalanx of navy blue and calculated indifference. And there we were, the two lead actors, sitting directly across from each other at the center of the long mahogany table. The air conditioning was humming, the water pitchers were sweating, and the tension in the room was palpable. But only I knew the true source of the frequency vibrating between us. To the uninitiated, we were hammering out the final sticking points of a $50 million liability agreement. To us, we were having a conversation in a private language, a dialect composed entirely of legal terminology and double entendres that flew right over the heads of the men who signed our paychecks. Victoria opened the floor with a discussion on the non-disparagement clause. She leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table, looking every inch the formidable managing partner. "We need to ensure," she said, her eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying intensity, "that this agreement is built on a foundation of permanent trust. We cannot have a situation where one party retreats to old defenses the moment a challenge arises." The room heard a lawyer protecting her client's reputation. I heard a woman asking if I was going to run away the morning after. I didn't blink. I adjusted the microphone in front of me, keeping my expression neutral. "My client understands the risks of exposure, Ms. Sterling. We are prepared to offer full disclosure and transparency, provided that the commitment to mutual protection is reciprocal. We aren't looking for a temporary ceasefire. We want a binding resolution." A corner of her mouth twitched, a microscopic break in her composure that only I was close enough to see. She tapped her pen against her notebook, a rhythmic, deliberate sound. "Reciprocity is the cornerstone of this deal," she agreed, her voice dropping just a fraction of an octave, turning the legal statement into a vow. If you are willing to sign off on the exclusivity of the terms, we are willing to open the books completely. The partners around us nodded sagely, scribbling notes about exclusivity clauses and audit rights, completely oblivious to the fact that we were negotiating the terms of our own entanglement right under their noses. It was thrilling. It was reckless. It was the most erotic experience I had ever had while wearing a suit. We choreographed the settlement like a dance, moving seamlessly from point to counterpoint. When her senior partner tried to interject with a harsh demand about liquidated damages, Victoria silenced him with a single, sharp gesture. She didn't look at him. She looked at me. She was protecting the balance we had found, ensuring that neither side felt conquered. When the final document was printed, 100 pages of dense legalese that would define the future of two corporations, the signing ceremony felt heavy with symbolism. I watched her sign her name, the ink flowing dark and permanent onto the page. Her signature was sharp, decisive, taking up space. When she slid the binder to me, her fingers grazed mine. It was accidental to the room, but deliberate to us. The paper was still warm from her hand. I signed next to her, our names aligned on the bottom line, bound together by the same terms, the same date, the same secret. The meeting broke up in a flurry of handshakes and relieved laughter. The tension that had held the room hostage for weeks finally snapped, replaced by the jovial backslapping of men who had just saved a fortune. But Victoria and I stood in the eye of the storm, quiet and still. "I'll walk you out," she said. It wasn't a question. We left the noise of the boardroom behind, stepping into the long, carpeted corridor that led to the elevator banks. The hallway was empty, a canyon of silence after the noise of the negotiation. We walked side by side, not touching, but the space between us was charged, magnetic. The professional masks we had worn so tightly for the last 2 hours began to dissolve. She stopped just before the elevator alcove, turning to face me. The relief in her eyes was evident, but beneath it was the return of that vulnerability I had seen in her office. The case, the thing that had brought us together, the excuse for every meeting, every late night, every touch, was gone. The structure was removed. "It's done," she said softly. "The case is closed. The file goes to archives." She looked at me, searching my face, her usual confidence wavering just slightly. "What about us, Morgan? Without the case, do we have standing?" I looked at the woman who had terrified me a week ago. The woman who had challenged me to undermine her defenses and then thanked me for it. I reached out, taking her hand in the empty corridor, interlacing our fingers. The risk didn't matter anymore. "I think," I said, squeezing her hand, feeling her grip tighten instantly in response, "that we both won." The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the empty car that would take me down to the street, and eventually, back to her. Our new world was waiting. The press release went out at 9 a.m., and by noon, the legal blogs were calling it the settlement of the year. My firm called it a windfall. I stood in the center of the partners' lounge, holding a glass of champagne I didn't want, accepting handshakes from men who had barely learned my name before this week. They talked about strategy and leverage, about how I had crushed the opposition. I nodded, smiled, and played the part of the rising star. But my mind was miles away, stuck in a quiet elevator, feeling the phantom pressure of a hand against my back. I saw her later that afternoon in the atrium of the Central Courthouse. It was strictly accidental. She was surrounded by her team, a wall of navy suits. She looked formidable, untouchable, the Victoria Sterling that terrified first-year associates. When she saw me, she didn't stop. She gave a single, curt nod. Professional, acknowledged, distant. It was the perfect performance. But as she turned, her eyes caught mine for a fraction of a second. The mask didn't slip, but the temperature behind it changed. It was a promise. A reminder that the woman in the suit was just a role she played. The rest of the day was a blur of paperwork. I went home to an empty apartment that felt too quiet. I sat on my couch, staring at my phone, wondering if we had just been a momentary lapse in judgment, a side effect of high-stakes adrenaline. Maybe, now that the ink was dry, the logic would return. Then, at 8:30, the screen lit up. No subject line. Just 5 words. My place. The case is over. I didn't think. I grabbed my keys and drove across the city. Her building was a pre-war limestone fortress on the Upper East Side. The elevator ride to the penthouse was agonizingly slow. I took a breath, smoothed my shirt, and knocked. I expected Victoria. I expected the silk blouses, the tailored slacks, the armor. The door opened and the air left my lungs. She was wearing a vintage rock t-shirt that was soft with age and gray sweatpants. Her feet were bare. Her hair was loose and messy, free of the pins that held it in check during the day. She held a glass of red wine, her face scrubbed clean of makeup. It wasn't just casual, it was a revelation. It felt more intimate than seeing her naked. This was the Victoria who existed when the world wasn't watching. "You're staring," she said, stepping back to let me in. Her voice was warm, lacking the sharp edges of the courtroom. "I'm adjusting to the new evidence," I replied, walking into the entryway. "I didn't know you owned a t-shirt." "There's a lot you don't know, Morgan," she said, closing the door. The lock clicked, a final, definitive sound. "But you have discovery rights now." She walked into the living room, and I followed. She turned to face me, leaning against a velvet sofa. The tension that had defined us, the professional friction, was gone. In its place was something quieter, heavier. "The settlement is filed," she said softly. "The terms are locked. Nobody is watching us anymore. I don't have to fight you tonight. I don't have to prove anything." I stepped closer, the distance closing easily. "So what does that leave us with?" She set the glass down. "It leaves us with the truth," she whispered. She reached out, her hands finding my waist, steady and claiming. "No more defenses to Undermine, counselor. The walls are down." I rested my hands on her shoulders. "Then we build something new, something that doesn't need walls." The kiss was different. It wasn't the frantic collision of the office. It was slow, deep. It tasted of wine and certainty. There was no urgency, no fear of interruption. It was a verdict, delivered not by a judge, but by us. We had won the case, yes, but standing there in the quiet of her living room, I knew we had won something far more important. We crafted our own agreement in the quiet weeks that followed, a private contract with no expiration date. It wasn't a document we could notarize, but it was binding all the same. We negotiated the terms of a new reality, boundaries that protected us rather than kept us apart, conditions that prioritized the person over the professional. We defined the force majeure clauses of our lives, what happens when the world tries to tear us apart. We stipulated that vulnerability was not a breach of contract, but a mandatory requirement for performance. We treated our relationship with the same rigorous attention to detail we gave our biggest cases, but this time, the goal wasn't to win, it was to endure. Victoria took me to Arthur's office the day after the funeral. The space was cavernous, a temple to a specific kind of masculine power, smelling of cigar smoke, old leather, and 50 years of unyielding dominance. It felt heavy with history, suffocating in its grandeur. But Victoria walked to the massive window and threw open the heavy velvet drapes. The afternoon light flooded in, bleaching out the shadows of the past and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She sat in the high-backed chair, not shrinking from its size, but filling it with a new, relaxed kind of authority. "He thought legacy was about the stone and the steel," she said, running a hand along the edge of the mahogany desk. "He thought it was about never showing a crack, never letting anyone see you bleed. But he died alone in this room, Morgan. That's not the legacy I want." "What do you want?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe, watching the woman who had once intimidated me become the woman who inspired me. "I want to choose myself," she said, looking up, her eyes clear and determined. "I want the work to matter, but I don't want it to be the only thing that exists. The legacy isn't the firm. It's the life you build when the billable hours stop." We began to work side by side. navigating a professional landscape that wasn't designed for us. To the world, we remained fierce competitors. I still objected to her motions. She still grilled my witnesses. But the animosity was gone, replaced by a secret, shared language. A raised eyebrow across the courtroom meant dinner at 8. A tapped pen meant I missed you. We were partners in a way the Bar Association had no category for. The transition wasn't seamless. There were days when the old instincts flared, when she retreated behind her walls and I armed myself with sarcasm. But we had the settlement to remind us. We had the memory of that first, desperate truce. One late night, we were back in that office, drafting the bylaws for a new legal aid foundation we were launching together. The city lights outside were blurring into a watercolor of gold and rain against the glass, but the tension inside was clear. It wasn't the jagged, fearful tension of our first negotiation. It was the hum of a machine running perfectly. She stopped typing and turned her chair toward me. Her hand reached out, covering mine where it rested on the desk. The touch was grounding, a reminder of the physical reality we had claimed from the wreckage of our professional defenses. "You know," she said, her voice low, vibrating with that intimacy that still made my pulse race. "You disrupted everything. You didn't just settle the case, counselor." I looked at our joined hands, at the way her fingers fit between mine like they had been measured for the space. I thought about the fear, the risk, the $50 million, and the empty elevator where we first broke the rules. "No," I said, meeting her gaze, feeling the absolute truth of the statement settle in my chest like a final judgment. "I settled into you." The final document we created wasn't something we could file with the court. It was the life we were sketching out in the margins of our careers. It was our names, written not as opposing counsel, but as partners in the only precedent that mattered. Her fingers laced tight with mine as the elevator began its smooth descent. The polished doors reflected us, standing close, unmasked, and ready. The doors clicked shut on the old world and opened to the new. The case is filed, the precedent is set. If you want to see what we build next, subscribe for more stories. The verdict is in. We both won.